Hello everyone, I'm Jesse Parent with Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. I'm talking today about embodied cognition and contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics. And what is that? And essentially what I'm going to do is just explain some of the concepts going on in our lab and what we've done and what's going to happen in the project I'm going to be working on this summer, hopefully. So quickly we're going to go over brain-moved vehicles, embodied cognition as a framework to look at things, and what is contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics, and what we hope to do with it. So what are these concepts we're working with here? I would essentially, this is the most important image in the slide. It's going to be representational free model of brain-moved vehicles with a representation-rich model involving contextual geometric structures. And we'll be coming back to these two different parts ahead. This is the abstract if someone wants to read it. We'll move right along, pause the video or come back to that later. But what is a brain-rig vehicle? A brain-rig vehicle is a thought experiment, essentially. It was created by Valentino Brainberg, his biologist and a cybernetician. And he wrote this book, Experiments in Synthetic Psychology. And what's very interesting about the vehicles is that they're very simple designs, very simple nervous system-like structure for a simple organism with complex behavior or appearance of intelligence behavior. You can see the classic example of vehicle 2 is two sensors, two wheels, and one stimuli, and how the senses are routed to the wheels depending on how the organism acts towards the stimuli. And what's interesting is that, we'll come back to this later too also a little bit. What's interesting is that all these vehicles were thought experiments based off of things in biology. Valentino Brainberg was inspired by what are the structures of the body that affect what the mind can do and how the mind works. A lot of the the cross connections, as mentioned, is one of them, and how information is interpreted in different parts of the brain and the nervous system. And we'll see in a little bit things like the appearance of emotion as well. Developmental brain-rig vehicles were essentially the project we worked on last year in our lab. And it's essentially adding neural networks, genetic algorithms to the original brain-rig vehicles. We have our preprint paper here. The Broadgen brain was a genetic algorithm that was Stefan's project primarily. He is using that to deal with the sort of evolutionary procedure for how attractors and repulsors and it would interact with the environment, and the creation of new vehicles with modified brains depending on how they interacted with the environments and the stimuli in the environments. And you see on the right, this is Ankud's project, which is kind of a visualization of the some swarm-like behavior, but also you see the stimuli in blue here, and the vehicles as the rectangles. The movement in 2A, for example, is the coward moving away from the stimuli, or 2B below it would be them approaching the stimuli rapidly. And so fear and aggression as these sort of emotions exemplified in original brain-rig vehicles now put to life in a slightly more advanced simulation. I apologize for not having animated GIFs here, but I couldn't quite get them to work on this, but check out the Figshare link below. Moving along, again, development of brain-rig vehicles and brain-rig vehicles are representation-free models, and we'll get to what is representation next. Embodied cognition is the framework we're using to talk about all of this, or at least I'm using. I think it's quite interesting. I think it's a great framework to look at investigating cognitive capacity. And my original application to this project 2 years ago was, I'm curious about how to toggle or look at the developments of capacity in cognitive ability, cognitive modeling, and how that affects what an organism, what an agent can do, what a system can do. Embodiment has a rich history, just to vaguely very generally refer to it, philosophy, phenomenology, cognitive science. And one of the debates in embodiment is how radical or how much representation is needed. There's kind of a split in theories of mind between representationalism and eliminativism, which is sort of, less or more representation. And this slide and related images are from Anthony Chimero's book, which is Radical Embodied Cognitive Science. And you can see a radical embodied cognitive science is sort of a approach to bring back eliminativism towards embodied cognitive science. And to explain that a little bit more, well, first, what is a representation? And in its most simplest form, you have an agent in an environment, and we have a representation of what's being represented. So you have this capacity to model or account for this represented item, entity, a classification of some sort. And here's another example of that. Let's move along to the next one. It's important to understand, okay, what is it? Is it mapping? Is it creating references? Yes. And sort of the other extreme of this conceptually is maybe represented by the every good regulator theorem by Conan and Ashby, which is essentially every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. So it's very representation heavy. And thinking about representation in a heavy sense, we have a familiar site. Thinking about the Google Maps location, we have an agent. We have pathways to choose. We have environmental features to navigate, and all of these things are represented in many different forms and layers of depth here. But specific to the goal right now of navigation, choosing the route, the town, the time, the distance, where you are in regard to the environment and what matters and how that's represented. But I also think it's quite interesting, and kind of what I'm alluding to in my hopeful work this summer will be inter-agent interaction. And this is a soccer or football match here with people on different teams and different sort of abilities or potential for each actor to take, and how is that represented is something that I think about quite a bit. And so where I'm going with this is I think it's useful to see embodiments and representation on a kind of a spectrum. If you have a low representation, essentially radical embodied cognition on the left, with original brain vehicles, and then high representation interactions on the right with Google Maps and kind of allusions to every good regulator theorem, that in order to regulate or deal with the system well, you have to model it very intensively. And I'm interested in, okay, where does this sort of spectrum, where are there interesting points on this spectrum, if you will? How much representation do we need to have certain layers of complexity and behavior, certain kinds of behavior? How much modeling capacity is necessary, and what can we do with just a little bit? Starting essentially from zero to very little representation on the right, or on the left, excuse me. What is adding a little bit a change? Again, looking at a hybrid model here. So now to contextual and the neurodevelopmental dynamics. The brain-brick vehicle consists of a body with sensors and information, processing connectors, and effectors, and essentially an analogy to the limbic system. And no representation here, mostly just reaction. But what we're getting at is adding something on top of that. In this case, a CGS, which we'll get to next, and that's a representational layer, sort of like the neocortex, you could say. We're getting at these very simple toy models, but again, this is what we're working at here. Contextual geometric structure, what is that? It's a way to model representation. It's a hybrid model. It's essentially Lagrangian inspired. you can see there's, depending on the dimension of what we're looking at, we can have a two-dimensional, three-dimensional view of it. There's space between the, excuse me, responses, the sort of the cultures of the identities of the individual agents may correspond to. Okay, here's this response, this particular culture, culture A or culture B. There's overlap in the green, and what does that get to here? Same image, next image. We can also map this onto a two-dimensional space where these are the agents and how they're associating to each other regarding their beliefs. Okay, these set of beliefs are closer to each other. These set of speeds are organized in this pattern. So yes. And again, developmental brain vehicles plus this contextual geometric structure layer into contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics, and fleshing that out more. What are we trying to do with this? What does this all lead up to? What can we observe by adding increasing amounts of representational capacity? And again, I'm reminded of this slide from earlier in the debate talk yesterday. This is kind of boring, low-level stuff, but at the same time, I think it's very interesting to look at what can these tiny increments and developments do. What can they afford us? Yes, and I think it's very interesting in the context of teamwork. What can multi-agent interaction do when they have these advanced representations? And one tool to do this obviously is agent-based modeling in NetLogo. If you're familiar with that, it's very popular for that. One of the original and still most used ones. So what can we do using NetLogo? What can you look at with multi-agent interaction? I'm interested in the concept of teams. In this NetLogo classic model, you have wolf and sheep, and then also interacting with the environment, which has grass. But the grass grows back depending on how sheep eat it, and the wolf eat the sheep. But what if we broke this down into different groups of, let's say, sheep? What would their identity be in terms of how other sheep interacted with them? Who's on my team? Who isn't on my team? Who am I going to care more about? Who am I going to secure or preserve resources for? And then, obviously, wolf in this context are predators, but bringing other agents into the discussion, other teams, how would that affect the development? And just adding one layer to that. What if there were more layers of identity, and so on and so forth? Is a team helping or hindering? Is someone being a team player? Is someone acting, operating of a particular culture? And how being able to identify these things add to robustness and complexity of behavior. Thank you. That's my presentation very quickly. Thank you to Bradley, Alicia, Stefan, Z, and Ankit of our team at Orthogonal Labs. And thank you so much to the presenters and organizers of Neuromatch. Appreciate all you're doing. Thanks.